give me faith. And we're looking at the life of Abraham and trying to understand from his life and also from our own experiences, what is it going to take for us to move forward in faith? And we started the first week by saying that if we're going to move forward in faith, we always have to leave something, right? And usually what we have to leave is something very, very familiar to us. And so we talked about Abraham had to leave what was familiar to him before he could move forward and understand what God wanted for his life. And the next week we talked about how the fact that we tend to, when God isn't doing it on our timetable, we tend to take things into our own hands, and that always goes bad, right? I mean, you have better hands than I do, but when I put things in my own hands, things really go bad. And last week we focused on the question in Genesis chapter 18, verse 14 that said, is there anything too hard for God? And we really looked at the fact that if we're going to pursue a God-sized vision for our lives, then we're going to have to pursue things that are too hard for us, but things that are never too hard for Him. And I hope throughout this series, you and I are going, give me faith. I want this kind of faith. Abraham wasn't perfect. He blew it. He tried to introduce his wife a couple times as his sister, and that always goes bad, right? Always. And so he never gets it perfect, but he's beginning to really put together this life of faith. And we're going to get there in just a moment. But isn't it interesting that there are many things in life where we are originally very eager to commit to them until we find out how difficult they really are? Like if you want to be a skilled musician, right? Brad, you don't just get up here on Sunday mornings, right? I mean, I don't want to fire you right here in front of the whole church, but you don't just get up here on Sunday mornings, obviously. It takes hours and hours. It takes discipline. It takes, obviously, a gifting, because I don't think any amount of hours would get me to being a skilled musician. I feel the same way about running marathons. I don't think any amount of training would get it there for me, and I'm not even willing to prove it. But literally, if you're going to run a marathon, you can't just go, man, that sounds awesome, that would be a great thing. It's going to take practice, it's going to take discipline, something about long runs, something about lack of carbs or lots of carbs, something about staying away from the donut shop. I mean, I don't get all that. But we get eager for things, and we're like, I want to do that, I want to be like that, and then we realize there's great difficulty in being like that. There's great difficulty in achieving that. That's the way we all feel the morning we're going to the DMV, right? Like, man, I've been shut down the last few times, but I'm going to win this morning. And then you get to the DMV, and somehow you can make an appointment, but the appointments don't always stick, and so literally you're like, I'm going to get it. I'm going to have the right forms today, and you get there, and you're like, you got all but one. And you've waited 3.5 hours. Anybody have a better experience at the DMV than that? Louie and Mark. This is why you guys were in California or in South Africa? We need to know the story. Tell us your secret later. You charmed them with that accent. Got it. Well, hey, this morning, I think along this series, I hope what we've been saying is, God, give me this kind of faith. But what we're going to encounter this morning may make us go, I'm not sure I want that kind of faith. So I just want to lay that out there. What we're going to talk about this morning, it is from the Bible, but it's also something very difficult to get our mind around. And so what I want to encourage and ask from you this morning, and from myself, is that we really approach this subject that we're going to address this morning with an open heart, with an open mind. But remember, the God we're going to encounter in this story is the same God who loves the world, okay? This is the same God who's got a great plan for Abraham's life. This is the same God who's given a child to Abraham and Sarah when they're 190 years old, respectively. So I want you just to know that that's the God we're going to encounter again. But you may be surprised by what we discover this morning. And so we'll be in Genesis chapter 22. And if you've got a Bible, you can turn there, first book of the Bible. If not, check it out on your iPhone. But if you want a Bible, we have those volunteers walking around the room. Raise your hand. They will hand you a Bible this morning. This is a gift from Epic to you. You can keep it indefinitely. You can just borrow it. It's yours, though. It is just a small way we say, hey, we believe as a church, God reveals Himself through many ways, but He really does this in the pages of the Bible. And we want you to know, and we want to know what He's like, what His desires are, what He can do in our lives. And so just take this as a gift from us to you. Also, you can follow along. There's quite a few apps out there for your smartphone and for your iPad or whatever it is that you use. And so follow along. We'll be in Genesis chapter 22, 1 through 14. Genesis is the first book of the Bible. If you just got one of those Bibles, so you can turn there, chapter 22, and we'll start where it starts in the very first verse. And remember, we're going to just really grab some takeaways as we walk down through this passage. And so I won't read the entire thing and then comment like many times I do. We'll just kind of comment as we go along and watch this drama unfold. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. First thing I want you to know before we go any further than verse 1 is this. God is going to test you and I in our faith. Certainly our circumstances are going to test our faith. Our spouses are going to test our faith. Our children are going to test our faith. Our employers and employees, we know they're going to test our faith, right? The devil might even test our faith at times, but I also want you and I to be very clear about this. God is going to test our faith. And it's not with an aimless, purposeless end to it. It's that He wants you and I to mature in our faith. And the Bible's very clear that our faith doesn't grow until we have really, in a strong way at least, until we have those moments of testing. That's when we know for sure that our faith is real, and that's when our faith begins to grow and mature. Verse 2. Here's what God says. He doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't he's not just kind of warming Abraham up to this really difficult idea. He says this. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, we're not giving parenting advice this morning based on verse 2. All right? He says, take your son, your only son Isaac. Now, if you are just catching up to the story, we know that this is the son that God promised Abraham and Sarah they would have a son. They're 75 years old when God speaks to them for the first time. They still have to wait another 25 years, but God has promised that you will have offspring. And they didn't have any children when God made the promise. And not until they're way on up in age do they begin to have kids. And my dad, actually, who's visiting with us this morning, and I'm grateful for that, he pointed this out to me last night as we were talking about the text. This is the very first time the word love appears in the whole Bible. Thanks, Dad. I have to move in so I can have really good messages. Take your son, your only son Isaac. This is the one that you love. The first time that this is mentioned in the entire Scriptures is right here in Genesis chapter 22. First time love ever gets into the pages of the Bible. So right away, this is difficult for me, right? Difficult for anybody else? Most of you who know me, you know that I have 3 boys. And I'm not a perfect father, and they are not perfect children. But they are incredibly valuable to me. And when I read this, because I think the best way I get into the message is for the message to get into me. So I want to grapple with this. I want to go, what is that really like for Abraham? He's waited his entire life. God's promised him a son. He's given him a son. Just in chapter 21, Isaac is born. I go, God, what would that be like for God to go, hey, Ben, I want you to take Elijah. I want you to take Sam. I want you to take Asher. The gifts that I've given to you, the really good gifts in your life. And I want you to go and I want you to offer them there as a burnt offering. That's where I'm going. I'm not sure I want Abraham's faith. It seems the more faithful we are, that the more God's willing to trust us with. And I'm not sure I want to be trusted like that. I'm not sure I want that in the future. But that's what God says to Abraham. We'll go on with verse 3 and follow. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. So you know what it's like. It's already a very painful thing for Abraham. It's a multiple-day journey for Abraham and Isaac and the servants that would go with them. But you know how it is. You're already feeling kind of this dull pain, but it's still pretty painful. But then he sees the place where it's going to go down. You can only imagine, I can only imagine that there had to be a new sharpness to his pain as he finally sees. Like there's no longer wondering like we're just out here, we're just taking a walk. I see it now. That's where it's going to happen. That's where the most difficult thing God has ever asked me to do is going to happen right there. Right there. Verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Pause. Just so we understand, obviously he's not a toddler anymore, okay? Right? A toddler's not walking up the mountain carrying the wood. Let's be clear on that. He lays it on him because Abraham's obviously well over 100 years old by now. Isaac's probably a teenager, probably a young, muscular teenager. He can carry this, so it's put on him. He's carrying it up the mountain. Abraham's carrying the fire and the knife. So understand that. That will be of huge importance later to understand that Isaac is strong enough to carry this. That's of huge importance. Hold on to that. And he took in his hand both the fire and the knife. So they both went together. Verse 7. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Imagine eavesdropping on this conversation. Isaac's like, "We've got everything, except for the sacrifice. Dad, where's the lamb? Where's the lamb?" Listen to Abraham's response. Now, in his response, you might see it as very spiritual, but I think he's just dodging the question. Verse 8. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. Verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Remember what I said a moment ago. We'll come back to the story. Abraham's not the only one that's trusting God in this, is he? And remember, the men are down at sea level, as it were. If Isaac is strong enough to carry the wood up there, guess what he's also strong enough to do with his dad? Somehow, not only Abraham understands that God's a faithful God, but his son has heard the stories about how his birth came about for years, perhaps, maybe the last 13, 15, 20 years. And so not only is Abraham following God in a very difficult way, but Isaac is not just a small, remember, he's not a toddler. He's not a toddler being tied up by his dad. He's allowing himself to be laid on the altar on top of the wood. Verse 10, how is this going to end? Verse 10. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Just in case you didn't get that. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Great picture of substitution here. Just when Abraham needed it, right? So Abraham called the name of that place. I might think of a few other names for the place. Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Difficult to understand the story, right? Just me? God gives him this incredible gift, this beautiful baby boy at the age of 100. And God has promised him that he's going to have many offspring. God takes him outside one day. He says, "Look at the stars." Abraham looks at the stars. He said, "Can you count them?" Abraham's like, "1, 2, no, I can't count them." And he's like, "That's how many your offspring are going to be. Too many to count." And at this point in time, we have no reason to believe. In fact, we know Isaac doesn't have any offspring yet. So if Abraham's going to be, as we sing these days in preschool, the father to many nations, he's going to need more than just one, right? I mean, you can't lay all that on Isaac. Especially not at this point, when he hasn't done anything to procreate. Here's what God is after. God wants to make sure that we love him more than what he does or what he gives us. God wants us to love him for more than what he does for us and more than what he gives us. Here are some examples of how this can go for us. Let's say that you're in this room and you're like Abraham and Sarah, and I know this is part of what's going on in our church right now because of the conversation I've had. You're like Abraham and Sarah. You want children. Hopefully your spouse does too. It's always good to be in agreement on some of those things. You guys want kids, and you're so desperate for God to give you children. Maybe it's your age, or maybe it's just like, I just want a child. I'm ready for the tax break. Bad idea as well. It's a lot more expensive than the deal you're going to get on the taxes. A lot more expensive. Well, let's say that God gives you this child. It very easily could be possible for you to love that child because you're grateful to God, certainly, but you could begin to love that child more than you love God because that becomes the focus of the treasure in your life, the thing that you love more than anything else. Or let's say for this church, I believe God's got a very strong vision for our church. I believe we're seeing part of that vision already become a reality, and we're so excited about what we believe God has in store for us this fall. We're going to be just unveiling some information to you in the coming weeks and months. We really believe there's a significant movement going to just continue to happen here, and we believe this fall is a key to what God wants to do and the vision that He has for our church, and we'll be telling you about that. Well, let's say in the next year that our church begins to grow exponentially. I will be a fan of that. Anybody else? That would be awesome, right? We need to be inviting people, praying, getting the word out, marketing, things like that. Let's say that begins to happen. Is it possible for me to begin to love my growing church more than I love God? I know me. If you don't know me well enough, the answer is yes. It's very possible. Here's the deal. If we choose to consistently love what God gives us more than we love God, then God is nothing more than a means to an end. Now, He's a means to some incredible ends. God promises blessing. He promises for those who abide in Him peace and joy. So there's a way in which God is a beautiful means to an end. But if God becomes in our lives a means to an end, meaning that we have faith so that He does this, literally what we've dumped Him down to is simply a genie in a bottle, right? So we're like, if I read my Bible 4 days this week, God's going to do this. If I go to church, God's going to do this. And if God becomes a means to an end, He's a little more to us than a genie in a bottle. More like a Santa Claus figure, right? We be good boys, and if we are good boys and girls, then He's got to respond and perform in a certain way. And I just want to tell you, be very, very careful of that. Because when we make God a means to an end, all the other things that we're talking about that are good gifts from God, those things become idols. This fall, September 18th, we're kicking off our big launch fall series, which is entitled Idols. And here's the tagline to the Idol series. When good things become ultimate things. When good things become ultimate things. Because it can happen with anything. This morning isn't so much talking about the bad things we need to get out of our lives and put God back on the throne of our lives. It's talking about when you and I allow good things to become ultimate things. We can do this with our relationships. We can do this with sex itself. We can do this with our jobs. We can do this with our money. We can do this with our success. We can do it with our church. We can do it with our spouses. We can do it with our children. Great gifts, would you agree? Those are all things that God designed. All things that God designed. All things that God counts as His good gifts to us. But when we make those things ultimate, when we make those things our God, when we make those things our idols, it always goes bad for us. And here's why. The first reason is this. God created us to worship Him, not His gifts. God created you and I not to worship those good gifts. He created you and I to worship Him. Secondly, God alone is worthy of our worship. And I don't care how beautiful your kids are, how awesome your wife is, how great any of the other things are, your job. Those things are not worthy of our worship. Another reason is this. Those things cannot hold the God weight in our lives. Let's say you have a child, right? And you know parents like this that make their kids little demigods, right? And so literally whatever the kid wants, they get. Right? If it's food, the answer is always yes. If it's to go do certain things with their friends, the parents have read studies, that's horrible, they don't need to play 10 hours of video games, but the kid begins to complain, they say yes. And what happens for the rest of that parent's life, their joy, their satisfaction is tied in whether or not they have perfect children. And you don't have perfect kids. So if your child's your God, guess what happens? They can't hold the weight of that. Your spouse cannot hold the weight of being God in your life. Some of you are like, I would love to get a spouse and try it. Maybe she could. She can. I don't care how beautiful she is. Listen, man, when it comes to wives, I think I've got the best. I really do believe that. I believe that Shauna is the greatest marriage partner God could have ever provided for me. But she cannot hold the weight of being my God. At the end of the day, she is not perfect. At the end of the day, I cannot find ultimate satisfaction in her alone. At the end of the day, she can't fill me from the inside. At the end of the day, she's a great wife. She's a horrible God. And if you and I make these things your success, your job, if you make your success your God, then it all unravels when your success lets you down. If I make church attendance as a pastor here my God, then I feel great when all of you come, and I feel horrible when you don't come. I feel very secure when you're here, I feel very insecure when you're not. We need to be very careful what we make gods in our lives, and a few reasons why also. And remember, God gives us good gifts, but those good gifts really do make horrible gods. And for Abraham and Sarah with Isaac, how could they not just value him? And they do value him, and value is good, and worth is very good. And prizing something like that is okay. But worshiping it and making it your God. And so what God is doing in this testing, though, we go, man, that's really, really cruel. What God is doing, He wants not so much for God to find out, I don't think God's want to know, man, will Abraham pick me or Isaac? I think God knows those things. I think God has that pretty much figured out. He knows our future. He knows Abraham's future. Part of me thinks that He wants Abraham to know that he genuinely values God more than any of his gifts. I think He wants Abraham to know that he genuinely values God more than any of his gifts. The next thing I want you and I to see is that God is worthy of our trust, even when He doesn't act in our preferred way. Had God told Abraham he would be a father to many nations? Had God told him that he would have many offspring? The answer is yes, all right? If I change my mind, I'm going to tell you guys ahead of time. Had Abraham given them this beautiful boy when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90?
Yes.
Yes. So Abraham believed that God was going to do what He said He was going to do, even if he's perplexed by the means of which God seems to be accomplishing His purpose. See, you and I, we are willing to give God our trust when He acts in our preferred way. True? And it's very possible this morning that the reality for many of us in this room is that we, even if we don't consider ourselves religious or even Christians, we would be willing to do life God's way if He would be willing to do it our way. Wouldn't we? That'd be awesome. That would be great. Or would it be great? And something I want us as a church to be very careful with is this. We have some brilliant minds in our church. I don't claim to be one of them. But we have people that are smart enough to really begin to believe that they get to dictate, or we get to dictate who God is and how He acts. And if you and I begin to think that we're creating a God that serves us, it's going to go really bad. It's going to go really bad. I want you to see something. We'll just have it on the screen here. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 through 19. It's a passage in the New Testament, but it's reflecting back on why Abraham did what he did with Isaac. And I want you to really get these words. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises, that's Abraham, was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, though through Isaac your offspring be named. Here's the why, verse 19. This is huge. This is Abraham. He considered that God was able even to raise him, that's Isaac, from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, He did receive him back. So Abraham's not just doing something stupid here. Abraham has begun to understand that God is worthy of his trust, even when God doesn't do it. When God didn't give Isaac to him the first time, in a time in which they thought they needed him, 10 years in, Abraham's 86. Remember, Sarah comes and says, hey, here's my servant Hagar. Go sleep with her. We need children. He didn't have it down then, did he? But 10 or 15, maybe it's 30 years later now, I'm assuming he's a teenager at least, he's learned so much from trusting God that God can be trusted because he's been tested before, that he believed God was going to keep His word. He did the math in his head. I've got one son right now. God's promised me lots of offspring. If Isaac dies, I can't have offspring. So I believe that even if I go ahead and kill my son, I believe God's powerful enough and true enough to His word that He'll raise him from the dead. Still, I'm not sure that I want this kind of faith. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. I like that. From which, figuratively speaking, He did. Because as Abraham lifted up the knife, in his mind at that moment, his son was all but dead, right? But he literally believed, I don't understand what God's doing, but I literally believe that He can raise my son from the dead. But it's still hard to imagine that this isn't a cruel thing to ask a father, isn't it? Or a mother, or a grandparent, whatever your kind of guardian or parental situation is that you relate closest to and most emotional with. It's still kind of cruel. So here's the question. Is it always cruel for a father to sacrifice his son? Is it always cruel for a father to sacrifice his son? Because in the New Testament, there's another great father-son parallel story to the Abraham-Isaac story. And there's an amazing amount of similarities. Let me just tell you 4 of the similarities. One of the similarities is that in the New Testament father-son parallel to Abraham and Isaac, the New Testament father and son, the father loves his son more than we can imagine, just like Abraham loves Isaac. In the New Testament parallel, the father values and places worth on his son's life, just like Abraham does Isaac. Another striking similarity is that in the New Testament father-son account, this is the father's only son, just like, at least through Sarah, Isaac was Abraham's only son. And then the 4th, maybe the last similarity that I'm pointing out this morning at least, is that that father also asked his son to carry wood up the hill. But a couple of astounding differences. For Abraham and Isaac, a beautiful substitution story happens. Isaac is there, he's bound. Abraham has the knife, he's going for it. God speaks through the voice of an angel and says, don't do that. Abraham looks up and he sees a ram in the thicket. He's like, this is awesome. There's a substitute for Isaac. Just imagine what it's like. How eager is he to get over to that ram? And Isaac's like, you got to untie me first, Dad. Right? So he's like, okay. So he begins to untie his son. And he's walking over, I can only imagine, to get this ram. And they're going to carry the ram back together. And both of them are going to try to go ahead and sacrifice it before God changes his mind, right? Beautiful substitutionary story. Now, the similarity in the father-son story in the New Testament, it's a beautiful substitution story as well. But in the New Testament parallel, there is no substitute for this son. In fact, the substitution story goes like this. This son, he's actually taken the place of many. Let me ask you again. In your mind, is it always cruel for a father to sacrifice his son? Wasn't this the most loving thing God could do for us? Isn't it the most loving thing God has done for us? Such a beautiful story. And I get it. God's not, He's not put off, I don't think, by our questions as long as we approach Him with a genuine and sincere heart. So I get the questions, right? I've got it. Like if God said that to me, I'm like, God, I don't know, man. I get the difficulty of the question. But I want to keep the difficult question in mind. I have no problem with that. I don't think God does either. But don't just center ourselves there. Make sure if you're going to ask the question that you also get to the beautiful depiction of the story you're asking the question about. Because the Bible's really clear that without someone paying the price for our sin, that we pay the price. So if you really want to go back to the analogy of the story, you and I aren't Abraham being asked to do something to our son. You and I are Isaac. And we need someone to desperately take our place. And if no one did take our place, you and I leave this room this morning going, okay, I'm hopeless. I'm hopeless. But not only do we need Jesus to take our place, Jesus desired to take our place. And it's awesome. It wasn't His need to take our place. It was His desire. It was our need. And as we continue to press on, and I continue to encourage you and me for your relationships, for your family, for our church, I want us to believe God for huge things. But you and I don't get to dictate how God does it. I'm praying God will give us a permanent facility. I've said that a lot lately. But I don't get to dictate how or when He does it. I've got some preferred methods. I've got a few preferred methods, actually. Doesn't seem to be doing it that way. I want God to allow us to impact the city for a long time to come. Our staff, we sat down the other day and we said, hey, let's get a whiteboard out and let's talk about what would we love to see God do over the next 10 years. The first thing I realized that I'll have a senior in high school, and that freaked me out a bit. But really, what would we love to see God do over the next 10 years? So we begin to put dreams, and I'm just going, the staff's throwing things out there. I'm like, you guys are crazy. You guys really are crazy. It did involve firing me. Hope that doesn't disappoint you. We begin to look at, man, what if God does that? Now, we have a vision, we have strategy, but we can't go, God, you got to do this in 2013, then you got to give us another campus in this neighborhood, 2015. What we can do is go, God, we believe you're good, we believe you have purpose, and we don't want to be the four of us going at this alone, saying, hey, here's the vision for God. We want you collectively. Bring your gifts, bring your big dreams to the table, and let's say, what might God do among us that would have long-lasting impact, that wouldn't just be something you and I come to on Sunday mornings and we consume, but we begin to contribute. And we begin to believe and we begin to pray like we believe that God really has a desire far beyond our own desire for what He wants to do in our church. The same is true in your marriages. The same is true where you work. The same is true in your friendships. The same is true with your children. You have great dreams for your life. That is great. God's dreams are bigger, but you don't get to dictate the way He carries them out. So you and I have one of two answers. I think always we've talked about this in this series. Keep living in your own small story where you can manipulate, dictate, and control. Or let's open our hearts and our minds and our lives up to what God wants to do, that we can't dictate, that we can't control, but that it's far more. Ephesians 3:20 says, now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or think. Let's open ourselves up to that God. He's a God who does good. He's a God who has great purpose, who has a great wisdom. His knowledge is far beyond what we know. But let's let Him call the shots. Let's let Him choose the path. Let's let Him choose the method, the means, even the timing. While it's difficult for many of us because we love to be in control, let's press on to become people who, like Abraham, God can say to him, hey, you trusted me even when you didn't understand. You believed me and took me at my word. May we do the same. Will you guys pray with me this morning? So many things to really conclude with, but maybe this is the one for us. Are you finding God throughout this series less trustworthy or more trustworthy? I pray that you're finding that He's worthy of your trust. Pray that you're finding that, man, this church thing may be a new deal for you, the God thing, the Bible thing. You've got so many questions. He's okay with that. But approach Him with humility. Approach Him with open mind and open hearts. God and Jesus paralleled the Abraham Isaac story in so many ways. But God, unlike Abraham, He couldn't let Himself off the hook. There was no other way. There was no other plan. There was no other substitute. Jesus was becoming the substitute for many, and that can include you this morning. So I pray that you would open your heart up. You have a place you can mark this on the communication card if you want to talk with a staff member. Maybe the step for you is getting into a group where you can explore faith issues. Everyone's welcome. You need no knowledge to attend. You don't have to have a Bible. You'll never be asked to do something that would embarrass you. I don't know what the next step is. I just believe that there's a next step for all of us. For me, I believe it's to quit having a survival mentality when it comes to my life and family and ministry. It's time to have a thriving mentality. God's not called us to survive as a church. He's called us to thrive. I need to begin leaning into more of that. What do you need to? God, I pray that you will lead us to the next step in our faith. God, I pray that we will not just go, how could you ask Abraham to do this? But we would go, God, thank you for offering a substitute for Isaac, and thank you, Jesus, for being the substitute for me. And God, would you give us that kind of faith? It may be the kind of faith we say at first we don't want, but God, we don't want to be just left to our own selves, God. We don't want to be left to our own small stories where we can control or sort of manipulate the events that happen and the outcomes that take place. God, help us open ourselves up and our hearts and our faith up to a big God who does good, who has purpose, even if we don't get to dictate that He does it in our preferred way. God, would you do great things in our individual lives, God, in our families this morning. God, in our church. We love you. Pray this in Jesus' name.